And for our final video, video 4, we are going to look at some common vaccine myths. This is something that I think a lot of people will be interested in, so let's get started. So in this class, we are going to look at some common vaccine myths and some of the misconceptions that surround them. We're going to look at mercury in vaccines, aluminum in vaccines, whether vaccines are even still needed, and that the side effects from the vaccines are worse than the illness they're protecting against. And then the big one, do vaccines cause autism? So a note before we get started, this video is not going to cover every concern that you might have heard of, or every myth that you might have heard of. I just couldn't do it. There's too many of them. This video will be days long. So if you search the internet, you're always going to find people making some new claim. And so what I would just recommend you do is look to trusted, verified, and expert-reviewed resources to find accurate information instead of on internet message boards where people can post anything, whether it's true or not. And so we're not going to cover everything that you may have heard of before, but we're going to try to cover some of the big ones. So the first ingredient we are going to look at is mercury, or thimerosal. I get asked fairly frequently, is there any mercury in this vaccine? And I give them the answer. So that's the key point of this slide. Thimerosal has not been in pediatric vaccines for almost 2 decades. I believe in 2001 is where it was removed from vaccines. It was used as a preservative and still is used as a preservative, but not in pediatric vaccines. Some key points about mercury. It is a naturally occurring element in the environment. It's in plants, it's in water, it's in the ground. It's something that we are exposed to and often ingest on a regular basis. If you were to ingest too much mercury, there's the potential it could eventually be toxic, because the naturally occurring mercury is slow for the body to break down, and so if you are exposed to it often, it could build up because your body is still working on breaking down what it was exposed to before. What's different about thimerosal is it is a different form of mercury that the body can break down more easily and quickly, so it doesn't build up to a toxic level or a dangerous level. It's kind of the difference between ethyl alcohol that you could drink versus isopropyl alcohol that could kill you. They're just different forms of the same element, but one the body can manage and the other it cannot. The only vaccine that you could potentially get as a child that could have thimerosal in it would be a flu vaccine that is taken from a multi-dose vial. So this is a vial that has 10 doses of a flu vaccine in it. That is the only available vaccine for children that is out there that might have thimerosal. Most offices are probably not going to use that multi-dose vial because there are lots of other flu vaccine alternatives out there that would not contain thimerosal. They're an individual syringe with 1 dose in it. So the likelihood that your child would get a flu vaccine with thimerosal is very low. And even if they did, the maximum amount of thimerosal a child would get from that multi-dose flu vial vaccine is 25 micrograms, which is an incredibly small amount, and that is well below all safety concerns for mercury. Your body can easily take care of that and break it down, but again, you are almost never going to have a vaccine given to your child that has thimerosal in it, because concerns were raised and they thought it would be easier to just take it out so that people would not have that concern. So thimerosal no longer in vaccines. So now let's talk about aluminum. Remember, in the first video we talked about aluminum. Aluminum is an adjuvant, and just a reminder, adjuvants are an ingredient in vaccines that whenever they're injected, they trigger more immune cells to come to the injection site. Because there are more immune cells there, that are finding the antigens were able to form immunity faster and more effectively than if the adjuvant was not in the vaccine. So this means that less antigens are needed in the vaccine because the adjuvant makes the vaccine more effective. But that brings up the question, why use aluminum? Aluminum is like mercury. It's naturally occurring in the environment. It's in water, it's in plants, it's in animals. Aluminum is everywhere. Infants eat aluminum too in their diet, even though they're not eating table foods. If you were to take all of the aluminum in all of the vaccines that an infant would get before they turn 6 months old, they get more aluminum from breast milk and even more aluminum from formula than they would ever get from all of those vaccines combined. Aluminum is used because it's safe. It's something that we are regularly exposed to. Our body is equipped and prepared to, whenever it's in the body, to isolate it and remove it, and we're not harmed by it. And it's used because it's effective. So it's both safe and effective. That's why we use aluminum. It has been in vaccines for decades, and billions of vaccine doses have been given, and there's not been a scientific study yet that has found it to be harmful. And the key point is that because aluminum is in vaccines, they're able to put less antigens in vaccines. So whenever you're talking about vaccines and you're concerned that it may be too many antigens that your child's exposed to, you can thank aluminum. It has changed vaccines for the better by making it where we can use less antigens in them, and the vaccines are even more effective than before. So now let's move away from ingredients and talk about big questions like, are vaccines even still needed? You might ask the question, if there are few or no cases of vaccine-preventable diseases in the US, why get those vaccines? So the reason there are so few cases of those diseases in the US is because of vaccines. The US has great immunization programs, and we have given them in doses to where we have herd immunity in our country. That's why we don't see as many outbreaks of these diseases. Just because we don't see the illnesses happening does not mean that they are gone. That is why whenever you hear about outbreaks, usually in areas where herd immunity is low, it's because those illnesses still exist. We just usually don't see them because we have enough vaccinated people to where most people don't get the illness. Each year around the world, millions and millions of people die from vaccine-preventable diseases. These are in places where vaccine programs are not as effective or harder to do. So these diseases still exist, and they can come into the country at any point, and there are areas around the country where these illnesses will still live. If we stop vaccinating, the diseases will come back. Now, some people will say they're not going to come back in my lifetime, and that might be true. You could say that you're not going to get your child vaccines, and they may live their entire life and not get it because herd immunity is so good. But if enough people are doing that, if it's not in this lifetime, it'll be in the next. It'll be the grandchildren then, where they are living in a world where herd immunity is so low, and these vaccine-preventable diseases will come back if we decrease vaccine rates. So maybe one day we will get to a point where we have totally eradicated these vaccine-preventable diseases because they don't have any human host to live in. But it's not going to happen unless we all continue to do our part. There has been situations or times where we've thought that polio was about to be fully eradicated in the entire world, and then there will be an outbreak in a place where vaccine rates were low. So we are close. There are several diseases where we might get to a point where that disease is completely eradicated, but we have to maintain high levels of vaccinations for that to take place. So now let's look at the idea that vaccine side effects are worse than the illness that they are meant to protect against. This is something I hear about sometimes, and I think it's just because we're not used to seeing these illnesses in our day-to-day life. So let's review. Let's go back to some of the most common side effects of vaccines. You have fever, pain or redness at the injection site, or fussiness. So then let's look at some of the complications that vaccine-preventable diseases can cause. You can see chronic liver disease or hepatitis, increased cancer risk from chronic inflammation, lifelong disfigurement or the inability to even use your arms or legs, meningitis or swelling around the brain, respiratory failure, pneumonia, birth defects, paralysis, sepsis or an infection in the bloodstream, coma, or death. If you compare these two lists from fairly mild side effects from the vaccine as opposed to the lifelong damage that these vaccine-preventable illnesses can cause, in my opinion, it's no question you get the vaccine to avoid what is undoubtedly a worse outcome.
So just a note on these topics of vaccines no longer being needed or the side effects are worse than the vaccine preventable disease. This is something that I have a hard time with because I think that the problem is that here in America we are so far removed from these diseases that we just don't think that they're a problem anymore. I have personally spent time in Africa and I did vaccine clinics whenever I was there, and I saw people that had walked for miles and miles with their children so that they could get vaccines. And there's a reason why they did it. The reason is they still see these diseases and they know how deadly and terrible they are. This is hard for us to come to terms with here because we just haven't seen these things for years and years, and we think that they're gone. They're not, and they can happen again. And even though that you may not have been in these experiences where you have seen these diseases firsthand, I'm just here to tell you they still exist and they can happen again. And we really have to remember that we can't fall back on our privilege as a country to stop doing vaccines, because that is just ignoring the fact that these diseases are still real.
So now let's look at the big vaccine myth. Do vaccines cause autism? So let's do a little history. Let's look at a study by someone named Andrew Wakefield. Now, when the study was done, his name was Dr. Wakefield, but his medical license has since been revoked, so I'm just going to refer to him as Andrew Wakefield. He released a study along with some co-authors in 1998 that made a claim that the MMR vaccine was linked to increased rates of autism. In his study, there were 12 participants, and 8 of those kids had autism. All of the children in the study had some sort of pervasive developmental disorder, but 8 of the 12 had autism. He asked the parents to think back to when they first started noticing autistic symptoms in their child. And the parents thought back, and they thought that it occurred around the time when the MMR vaccine was given. So let's just stop right there. If you've ever done any research on what makes a good medical study, then you're going to see the red flags. For a study to try to make this claim, it needs to include hundreds, if not thousands, of children to even make this claim, and then it needs to be proven in larger studies. This study had 12 children. You also, if you're trying to prove this, you need to be looking at children that were healthy and watch them develop autism from the MMR vaccine or after they receive it. You need to be watching it occur, not having someone think backwards on when they think the symptoms started. This study has so many flaws that just in the way that it was planned and put together. Add on to that After the study was released, it was discovered that the study participants were recruited by a lawyer who was in the process of suing vaccine manufacturers. So on top of an already poorly put together study, now you introduce bias, a reason for the study to make a claim against the vaccine companies. So this is everything that all the concerns you've ever heard about vaccines causing autism link back to this poorly planned and put together study.
So, what happened after the study came out? Eventually, people started to realize how poorly managed and all the ethical concerns with this study, that the co-authors began dropping off and saying, we no longer support what was printed, and we don't believe in this theory anymore. The study was eventually formally retracted by the publisher. They took it out, they printed a retraction to say, we no longer can support that this study was in our publication because there are too many ethical issues, it was poorly planned, the results are faulty. And so it was formally retracted by the publisher. Andrew Wakefield was then charged with misconduct, and he was banned from practicing medicine. So the individual most responsible for perpetuating this myth of autism being caused from vaccines, he faced formal legal charges for what he said. He was banned from practicing medicine.
So even after all of that, after this study was retracted by the publisher and Andrew Wakefield lost his license, this belief has continued that the MMR vaccine specifically, or really any vaccine, causes autism, even though the original claim was false. Since then, there have been multiple measles and mumps outbreaks around the world since that time, including in the US. You've probably heard of numerous ones in the news over the past several years. There have been numerous studies all over the world on this topic since Wakefield's study. And in all of those studies, if you add them all together, there are millions of children and decades of research that have been studied, and none of them have shown any evidence that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And I'm going to provide a link to that in the references for you to look at one resource that has a collection of these studies and the results. So let's look at just the facts. Autism is usually diagnosed around the same time a child would get an MMR vaccine. Usually the earliest that parents start noticing autistic behaviors is about 2 years old. Kids get their first dose of the MMR vaccine about the time that they're 1. And so they get a dose of the MMR vaccine, and then in the months or the year later, parents start noticing autistic symptoms. Another time that kids get an MMR vaccine is before they go into kindergarten. And so let's think about that. Before kids go into the education system where they're going to have teachers or people noticing a child's behavior that maybe parents didn't notice. So just because kids are getting MMR vaccines before these times where autistic symptoms are usually noticed, this does not mean that the MMR vaccine causes autism. They happen around the same time. That does not mean that it causes it. In fact, there's never been any link found between any vaccine and autism. Some different ways we can look at this. There have been increases in autistic diagnoses over the past several years. Those increases have never matched up with increases in vaccination rates. The autistic diagnosis rate is increasing on its own. The reason why is because in the past decade or so, we've developed a lot of great tools to diagnose children with autism. You also have increased awareness in the world and in the community, and parents are just more likely to notice these symptoms. And autism is a spectrum. You can see different versions or behaviors with autism. So the diagnosis has expanded to include more children under this term, but they may be having different symptoms. There have been extensive resources, so a lot of money and time and effort has been put into disproving this claim about vaccines causing autism, because vaccines are so important. We can't have this false claim decreasing vaccination rates. And so we've spent so much time and effort in trying to disprove this claim, and all of that time and effort could have been spent on autism research instead. So these are the facts. These are the things that we need to remember. There's never been a true link found between vaccines and autism, because there's not any. And we should be spending our time helping children with autism and researching why it happens and if we can prevent it, instead of essentially wasting our time disproving this already false claim.
So, just to review, the ingredients that people are generally concerned with, mercury or aluminum, they're either no longer in the vaccines, or they're not higher than the exposures we get in our day-to-day lives, and our body is more than equipped to manage those and remove them from the body. Vaccine-preventable illnesses can easily return if the population stops vaccinating. And then vaccines are safe with minimal side effects, especially if you compare them to actually getting the diseases they're meant to protect against. And last but not least, say it with me, vaccines do not cause autism. There has never been any scientific proof to support that claim.
All right, well, this is what you're used to. Here's all the references that were used in this presentation. As you already know, they're going to be posted below and on the reference tab of this website. And so I hope you look into these. Again, there are so many good resources out there, and list of all the different studies that have disproven some of these myths. And so I hope that you take the time to go through these websites and research them more on your own to come to your own conclusions about disproving these false claims. But I'm glad you stuck through this video. I know it was a long one, and thank you for your time.